the drivers have awesome flexibility. Summer vacation, fall break, Christmas break, they have that time off.
And not being 65, I don't have Medicare, so the school district offers a great benefit package, so that was important to me. Very flexible hours. I've always been an early riser, so I'm up at 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning, so I can come in and do a morning run, still get home in time to have breakfast with my wife, and then afternoon around 1 or 1:30, come back to the yard and jump on the bus and do an afternoon run, and still be home for dinner. It's really a very flexible schedule. So if you come on board, there's a signing bonus that they pay out after completion of your training in your first 6 months and then your 1-year anniversary. There are retention bonuses now for drivers to stick around and come back.
The bus driver is transporting someone's kids, a group of kids that are not their own, but we all know how valuable our children are. And so it's a very important job. It's a huge, massive amount of responsibility and extremely rewarding at the same time. And so for me personally, my goal is that in the morning, I smile, hey, how you doing? Have a good day. When they get off the bus in the morning, have a good day, learn something new.
One day, this probably a 4th grader got on and handed me a card. And I opened the card and it said, Grandma and I just want you to know how much we appreciate you getting me to school safely. And it's like, what else is there? You know, that's the best card I got all year.
We all play an essential role in each child's day at school, whether it's learning or being fed and getting the nutrition they need so that their little minds and bodies will work to their full capacity. And I just love the children. I do this because I love to interact with them.
I'm grandma status, you know what I mean? So I'm not their mother, I'm not a teacher. You know, I'm here to feed you like a grandmother does, make sure you eat healthy, and you're on your way. I make sure I try to know most of them's name. With the mask, it's been a little hard over the past few years. But I try to know their names, and I try to talk to them. We joke, we laugh, and you know, when things come up, they come and talk to me and tell me what's new in their life, so it's good.
I love it. I love working mornings, especially you get to see the kids in the morning eating breakfast and just watching them play and seeing their happy little faces running around. I love what I do. I get to interact with teachers as well as all the students walking around, and it's always nice hearing, "Good morning, Ms. Zareda."
This school culture here is amazing. It's one of inclusion, it's one of pride and support and teamwork. And being a part of that gives me ownership. It helps me to feel like I'm part of something special, which we are. These children deserve the best, and so we work our hardest to meet their needs and provide them with a happy, safe environment.
To me, I feel like we're family. We are very close. We're a big team here. We're all here for each other. We're all a very big support group for each other. That's what I really love about being here.
As the largest employer in Northern Nevada, Washoe County School District is truly the heart of our amazing community. With more than 62,000 students in their care, WCSD's staff is made up of passionate and caring individuals who have a daily impact on the lives of Washoe County's most precious citizens, our children. WCSD is an employer who is committed to building a diverse and innovative workforce, and we value the background and experiences that all of our employees bring to our schools and students. As a full-time employee with WCSD, you can expect to receive a benefits package that includes one of the best medical plans in Northern Nevada, along with enrollment in and contributions to Nevada's public employee retirement system. If flexibility is what you need in your career choice, WCSD offers support positions that can fit almost any schedule. And with schools located across Washoe County, there is a great chance you can find the perfect job right in your neighborhood. But perhaps one of the most important benefits of working at WCSD is the ability you will have to transform the education experience of our students. Passionate, caring, and committed to providing Washoe County's children with the best education experience possible. If these words describe you, please apply with WCSD and join the heart of Washoe County.
Working with the families and the communities has been some of the greatest aspects of the job, making sure that I'm involved in school as a professional, but also within my community as a proud person who just lives here in the Reno-Sparks area.
My job as principal is to help make sure that I'm setting my teachers up to be able to plan for and execute lessons that make every minute count, that they're excited about, their students are excited about, and they ultimately feel tremendous success as a result of all that hard work.
One thing that kind of drives what I do every day is to take care of people. We want to be here to support people. We want to celebrate the positives. We want to find the good.
One thing I love to do every year is learn as many names as I can. COVID has made that really hard, especially with masks. But that's one thing personally I pride myself on, is knowing the names of as many kids as possible.
My experience with Washoe County School District has been really positive for my personal and professional growth. It's given me opportunities to be really innovative at the schools that I'm serving, working with the teachers, staffs, other administrators, learning from one another in a collaborative nature.
And I think that's really a trademark of the Washoe County School District, is we really view this as we're all in this together. Especially coming through the other side of the pandemic, I think we've really grown together as a community to support one another. And I think anybody relocating to this area would really feel that.
Being a state employee, we are part of PERS, which I appreciate. As a family of educators, my wife and I both in the Washoe County School District, that is a benefit that we look forward to. The Washoe County School District does their best to get us what they can and offer us what they can to be competitive with other employers, whether it's inside education, outside education.
Sounds like you do a lot here to keep the students and staff.
I didn't open it yet, but I like to open it when I can. Yes. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone to this evening. This is our second of two virtual budget forums tonight. We are excited about hearing from the community members as well as families of the Washoe County School District. My name is Dr. Angie Taylor, and I am the president of the Washoe County School District Board of Trustees. I have some colleagues with me. We'll introduce them in just a little bit. So on behalf of all of my colleagues on the Washoe County School Board, I want to thank you for joining us both to learn about a little bit more about the 2022-23 budget for the district, and also to provide your input, suggestions, and your feedback. We truly value everyone's voice in this process, and our attempt tonight is to provide a convenient and easy way for you to participate. You'll learn more about that in just a moment. We've enjoyed much success with these virtual forums in the past, and we look forward to having another successful one here on tonight. Tonight, we are coming to you live from the administration's boardroom here in the administration building for the Washoe County School District. And this is being, as I said, live streamed on our YouTube channel. And this recording will also be archived on our website for anyone who wants to view it at a later time. Again, we encourage everyone to participate as much as you can. If you need to jump back on later, then the information will be there for you. Most of our trustees tonight are watching this evening virtually, watching this evening's budget forum along with you. And all of the trustees understand the importance of the district's budget and making sure that we have your input as decisions are made. So I'm going to begin by having the trustees who are here with me tonight and as well as other members on our panel have them introduce themselves. I'll start with my far right with my colleague, Clerk Manetto.
Hello, I'm Ellen Manetto, and I'm in District B.
Hello, Trustee Diane Nicolette, District G.
I'm going to jump in and make sure I introduce my district so my district doesn't feel left out. District E.
Thank you very much, President Taylor. Superintendent McNeil, thank you all so very much for joining us this evening.
And good evening. I'm Mark Mathers, Chief Financial Officer.
Hello, I'm Jeff Bozzo, the district's budget director.
And I am Colleen DeLong, and I am with the Office of Communication and Community Engagement.
All righty. Thank you, everyone. We're going to begin tonight with our Chief Financial Officer. But again, as we jump in, if you have questions, comments that you would like to share on tonight, then you can do that. You'll hear this several times tonight by just emailing questions at washoschools.net. We're going to begin tonight, as I said, with our CFO, Mr. Mark Mathers, and our budget director, Mr. Jeff Bozzo. They're going to begin by sharing an overview of this massive budget we have here at the Washoe County School District, the largest budget in our community. They're going to try to keep this high level because it can get really bogged down, but because it's really complex and because of the complex nature of the district's budget, then they're going to need to cover some fairly technical matters. And then after our presentation from Mark and Jeff, we will open up the forum to our question and answer period. Now, Clerk Manello is going to just take us through how this is going to occur on tonight.
Thank you, Madam President. We are very interested in hearing from you, our stakeholders. To submit your questions, please send us an email to questions@washoeschools.net. Now, this address is at the bottom of our screen. We have already received several questions from the community, and we will try to answer as many as we can. But we will need to conclude this virtual forum by 6:30. And we may not get to your question. If we cannot get to your question tonight, staff will be emailing you within the week. We will also group our questions together and not answer them individually, as we have already seen some trends in the questions submitted in advance. And now I will turn it over to our very own Superintendent, Dr. McNeil.
Thank you so much, Trustee Manetto, and thank you all again for joining us this evening. This is an extremely important presentation that we're going to be going into tonight for our district's fiscal year 23 budget. As you know, our district budget impacts our students, our families, and importantly, our staff. Besides our CFO, Mark Mathers, and our budget director, Jeff Bozzo, we also have in our audience today leadership team members, both from the operations side and the academic side, to help answer our questions. So again, thank you so very, very much. And as Trustee Manetto said, we will be presenting this information, and our budget forum will end at 6:30 this evening. So with that, President Taylor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Superintendent McNeil. Again, we're going to go to our staff. You're going to hear mostly from them tonight because they have the information that is necessary, but we welcome your questions. Please get them in. We were able to get through all of the questions last time with some great work from Colleen grouping things together, and we hope to do so tonight. With that, I should say, I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Mather.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. So we do have a PowerPoint presentation for you. It'll take roughly 20-25 minutes to go through this, and I know this can be very technical, like Dr. Taylor said, but we think it is important for our audience to have some context when we talk about how we're funded and talk about the constraints and parameters we work under when we prepare our budget. Just a little preamble here. We're going to focus on our general fund budget, which is roughly $500 million. We won't be talking too much about our capital improvement program budget or other funds we manage, and those are also around $500 million. So in total, our budget is approximately $1 billion, our annual operating budget. But again, we'll focus on the general fund. And so for tonight, I'm going to cover items 1 through 3, which give you that background, talk about how we're funded, and then Mr. Bazo will cover items 4 through 6, where we'll go into how our budget is put together and how we're looking so far. So just a few quick facts about our budget, since some of you are new to kind of this process. A lot of folks remember when the district was having a number of financial challenges and think we're kind of still in that situation where we have a deficit. And we're happy to kind of clarify that we've actually had 3 straight fiscal years where we've had a balanced budget. And in fact, we presented a balanced tentative budget to our board in March. So that'll be 4 straight years where we've had a balanced general fund budget. And when we say that, we mean ongoing revenues are sufficient to cover our ongoing costs. So that points to, a new era of stability and sustainability here with our budget. But at the same time, it's important to remember kind of the painful and difficult decisions we had to make to get there. And those were roughly from 2017 through 2019, where we cut more than $60 million out of the general fund budget. Either those were actual reductions of positions and other costs, or cost shifts out of the general fund to another fund. So again, some very difficult choices our board had to make at the time, but they made them, and we're now in a stable position, which you can see on the chart to the bottom right, where you can see we started to dip into our cash pretty significantly back in 2015, and then have kind of righted the ship, and you can see we've had some mild surpluses the last 3 fiscal years. That all being said, it's still a safe statement to make that fiscal support of K through 12 education in the state has not been strong. It continues to kind of lag inflation, certainly this year, as it has in the past. So a lot of people have the notion of the district perhaps being top heavy or just mismanaging its expenses, but that's really not the case. It's all about revenues. And you can see in the top right of this slide, we compare our revenue growth from fiscal year 16 through fiscal year 20 to that of our other local governments in the region, Washoe County and the 2 cities, Reno and Sparks. Our revenue growth has actually been half of those other agencies. And so while those other agencies enjoy the growth of tax revenues when the economy is booming, like it basically is now, we don't. We're locked into what the state has already budgeted us to receive. And so even if the economy is going great, like it is now, unlike the cities and county who get all that extra tax revenue, we do not in our current operating budget. For those who've participated in past virtual forums, you'll also remember that under the old Nevada plan, the old funding formula that the state used, our per pupil funding was never enough to cover inflation growth, except for fiscal year 20, when the governor did fund a 3% cost of living adjustment, or COLA, to all school district employees, and that was wonderful, and we were happy to pass that along to our employees. So that was really the only year where we saw an increase in our funding that exceeded inflation. So it's been a very difficult, challenging road. Again, we continue to balance the budget, but unfortunately we just don't have additional funding usually for any increased positions or to cover any increased costs we have. And that's shown in the next section, where we provide some funding comparisons of how Nevada as a state compares to other states. So we start with the National Education Association. They do an annual ranking of the states, and in their most recent report that covers the 2019-2020 school year, Nevada actually ranked 45th in terms of per pupil revenues, and that includes all revenues. It's not just state revenue, it's not just local or federal revenue, it's all revenues put together. We ranked, again, 5th from the bottom at a per pupil number of $11,236. So that includes, again, not just the general fund, but other supports for special populations like special education. When you tally it all up and divide through by the total number of students, Nevada's provided $11,236 per pupil versus just the national average of $15,673 per pupil. And as a result, Nevada has some of the highest class sizes in the nation as well. Nevada as a state averages 21 students per teacher, whereas nationally it's closer to 15. And then we also fall in the bottom half of teacher salaries. So again, this is all a reflection of kind of the lack of funding for school districts in Nevada, and we don't mean to complain about it. It's just a fact of life and goes to show why, in some cases, we have to do with less. And that's why we do have higher class sizes and don't provide all the supports and programs we'd like to. For those interested, we looked at a number of other surveys and studies that are done nationally, and virtually every study you see, we again rank very near the bottom in terms of either per pupil spending or per pupil funding. So no matter where you look, that really is the case. In the most recent Education Weekly Quality Counts report, we were 47th in per pupil funding, but we were actually last in terms of their finance rankings. So we were ranked 50th among the states in that regard. However, in that same report, it was interesting to see that Nevada as a state ranked 18th in terms of academic achievement. And so 18th's not as nice as being in the top 5 or 10 for sure, but I think that's indicative of a really actual good return on investment. If we're last in the nation in per pupil funding, but 18th in terms of academic achievement, you can maybe imagine, picture how good we would be if we were only funded at the national average. So again, I look at this as a pretty good return on investment, but again, not where we want to be. So let me go into a little bit more depth about how school districts are funded in Nevada so that you have that context before we talk about our general fund budget process. The state back in 2019, just several years ago, actually made a major change in its funding formula. It replaced the old Nevada plan, which had been in existence for more than 50 years, with a new plan called the Pupil-Centered Funding Plan. And that made a number of really dramatic changes about how pupils receive funding, school districts receive funding, which we won't go into certainly to the depth that you would need to understand every change that it made. But the basic premise here is funding follows the student. So there should be adequate funding and supports for students with special needs. You should see roughly the same level of funding per pupil at a school across town from each other. And so that was the basic premise of the plan. But one of the major changes it caused was to pool together all revenues that go to support K through 12 education in the state. We used to get some local revenues here in our treasury, and then the state would get some revenues, and so it was kind of a hybrid plan of funding. Now, virtually all funding sources that go to support schools is pooled at the state level. They get all of that money, and then they distribute it down to each school district based on this new formula. So this chart shows you what those funding sources would be. In fiscal year 22, total funding for schools was $4.4 billion. A lot of that came from our portion, or school district's portion, of the sales tax rate we all pay when we buy a good, a washing machine, a refrigerator, or whatever. That's $1.7 billion annually. Then there is a property tax rate of 75 cents we all pay if we own a home, and that's $860 million. And then there's also a portion of the state's budget that goes to support K through 12, and that's $1.4 billion. So again, in total, it's $4.4 billion, but it's, again, all goes to the state, and they decide who gets what and how that's distributed. So this slide shows you kind of schematically how that works. When we talk about funding for schools, there's base funding, and that's $3.6 billion, and that's the funding that goes to educate every child in the state. And then on the right, you can see the special supports that are given for children with special needs, whether that's special education or what we call weighted funding, which is in that middle box on the right, which goes to English learners, our gifted and talented students, and our at-risk students. So they go kind of in two separate paths or channels. The base funding goes through two major equity adjustments, and that's why you see, very large differences in how school districts are funded, even in the state. So on the bottom left, you can see the the districts with the three highest level of per pupil funding. So in Eureka, they receive almost $34,000 per child, and that's because they're kind of sparsely populated. They're a very small district, and they have therefore very small class sizes. They have less of a base of revenues to spread their administrative expenses over. And then you can also see the districts with the lowest per pupil funding, and as this slide shows you, yes, indeed, Washoe County School District gets the lowest amount of per pupil funding in the state. We get $7,318 per pupil, which is lower than Clark, who is much greater than us, or Carson City. So, and again, I know this is very technical, but we get this question a lot, which is, well, what are these equity adjustments you're talking about? So the first one is for small districts or small schools, and you can see again on this table to the right, kind of we all start with $7,029 per pupil, and then there are these equity adjustments for small districts and small schools, which can make adjustments of anywhere from $67 to $11,000 per pupil. So the small district adjustment goes to every district besides Clark and Washoe. Some of those I don't actually consider small, but they all get an adjustment of some kind. And then if a district has kind of geographic areas that are kind of isolated, they also get a small school adjustment. So we do actually get that adjustment for Gerlach and Incline Village, Verdi, Wadsworth, and some other areas. So you can see those total adjustments amount to $115 million, and we receive $15 million. The other adjustment is what's called the Nevada Cost of Education Index, or more generally what's called the Comparable Wage Index. And that equity adjustment, it tries to adjust for counties and wages offered to other professions in the county. So the premise here is that school districts have to compete for labor. So when someone graduates from college, they can either choose to go in a particular profession or be a teacher, so we have to be able to compete. And this adjustment tries to adjust for different wage levels by county. Unfortunately, we think there are real problems with this calculation. It is not compensating our workers for the high cost of housing, and we have the highest cost of housing in the state. So you can see in this chart, we are at the bottom index number of 1.00 along with Carson and Douglas and Lyon, whereas Clark County gets an adjustment of 1.03, and there are a number of rural counties that are right around 1.027. So what this is saying is, as ludicrous as it may sound, that Churchill County, for instance, needs more money to pay their teachers a higher wage than Washoe because the cost of living in Churchill and the competition for wages is more intense in Churchill than Washoe. So you can tell we obviously have issues with this. The total dollar value of adjustments is $84 million, and Washoe receives nothing. So we have continued to work at the Commission on School Funding that I sit on and other areas to lobby to correct this. We are working on that. The Commission took a vote to recalculate this. We just haven't seen work done on that quite yet. But this is a huge issue for Washoe, and again is a primary reason why we have the lowest per pupil funding in the state. So again, revenues are pooled, all school district revenues virtually are pooled at the state and come down to each school district, and this is just a pie chart that demonstrates that. Roughly 98.6% of our general fund revenues come directly from the state. So they basically control our destiny. We don't have the ability to raise fees. We don't have the ability to impose new taxes to increase the size of the pie for us. This is just what we get from the state, and this is what we have to live with. So I think that gives you enough context to consider when we talk about how we build our general fund budget, and with that I will turn it over to our budget director, Mr. Bozzo.
Thank you, Mark. So I'm going to start off with how we build our general fund budget, beginning with what a budget is. And a budget is our spending plan for the year. It's divided up into all kinds of different categories, but that sets our total expenditures for the year and our spending plan for the whole school year. There's several state laws and regulations surrounding the budget process, so it's very constricted, including the timelines of when we have to file our tentative and final budgets. Once the budget is set for the year, it's pretty much set. If we do have additional revenues during the year, other resources, then we can adjust our expenditures, but that's the only way we can adjust mid-year. And then lastly, our district's budget is a policy document, so that's what this budget funds the priorities of our district. And every year during the budgeting process, we reevaluate the budget to make sure it's aligned with our district's priorities. So when we build the budget, the first step is to estimate expenditures and revenues, match those up. So when we look at expenditures, the first part is the base budget. So that's our district's salary and benefit costs and our non-personnel costs such as utilities, transportation, fuel and maintenance costs, school supplies, other things like that. So if we know of any contract changes or inflation adjustments, then we adjust those expenses in that direction. Also, if we know of any negotiated increases for our salary and benefit costs as well. We also review our staffing guidelines and update our school allocations based on enrollment for the upcoming school year, as several of our school allocations are enrollment based, so they fluctuate with increases and decreases to enrollment. We then look at revenues, and we look at the state budget in a legislative session to see where our revenues are going to end up, and by the end of the session we have a funding bill that determines what our funding is going to be for a 2-year period. We also have some minor local revenues such as earnings on investment and some other reimbursements that we estimate, and we update those as part of the budgeting process. So then we get to the point where we compare our expenditures and our revenues, and if we're looking at a budgeted deficit, then the board will direct staff to look at options for resolving that budgeted deficit. And if we have a surplus, which we had a preliminary surplus this year, then we can look at ways to use that surplus. So again, we're mainly state funded, so when we look at funding, we take our per pupil amount, multiply that by enrollment, add some other state revenues and local revenues, and that's going to be our revenue for the year. So all of our spending decisions are driven off of how much revenue do we have. So when we look at different spending decisions, we have cost increases. So we have employee step increases on an annual basis. If there's any cost of living adjustments that have been negotiated, or inflationary impacts like fuel increase or contract changes, then we look at those. But we also have the potential for cost decreases, such as, are we experiencing vacancy savings? Do we have more turnover savings than we have in a normal year? Turnover savings is when a more experienced employee retires and is replaced by a less experienced employee, and therefore there's a cost savings when that turnover happens. If we're in a situation where we need to look at across the board reductions or other type of reductions, then we will do that as well. So this slide here highlights the importance of a balanced budget. So if we have a structurally balanced budget, so again, that's when ongoing revenues equal ongoing expenditures, then that puts us in a better place to, one, not have to use our fund balance or cash reserves to pay for ongoing expenses. We can use those for unexpected expenses, and also to make sure we're meeting our cash flow needs. So our FY23 budget is shaping up pretty well. This first slide here, we saw this pie chart earlier in the presentation, And again, 98.6% of our general fund revenues are funded by the state. That's funded by our per pupil number multiplied by our enrollment, and we're expecting enrollment to be flat this year, or next school year. Our expenditure changes, these are the major ones. So first, those step increases and cost of living adjustments for employees I mentioned earlier are estimated to increase by about $12.7 million. But then that turnover savings was about $6 million this year. So the net cost of salary and benefits was just over $6 million increase this year. We also have expansions of our O'Brien and Swope middle schools and a new Hug High School coming on board. So there were some additional costs related to the rezoning and expansions of those schools. And then we also have experienced or felt the impact of inflation to goods such as fuel and other utilities. So earlier in this fiscal year, we had to make an adjustment for increased fuel costs. We built that into the FY23 budget as well. This next slide here breaks down our general fund expenditures on a per pupil basis. So we have several categories that our budget is broken down into. These first two, direct instruction and student and school support, are where we spend a majority of our funds. So direct instruction, these are our general ed teachers, special ed teachers, gifted and talented, English learner teachers, teacher aides and assistants, things like that. And then our student school support include counselors, psychologists, school nurses, other positions like social workers and other academic support. And that represents about 77.7% of our per pupil spending. The next category, operations and transportation, so those are our facilities departments and student transportation. That represents about 13.7% of our per pupil number. And then this last bucket here is central services, which is about 8.6% of our per pupil spending. That number also includes district-wide expenses such as IT contracts and other items that impact all sites and students and staff throughout the district. So like I mentioned earlier, we had a very small preliminary budget surplus, but that's a much better place to be in than having a deficit. And this surplus was mainly related to two things, and that was higher indirect cost revenues from having more stimulus funds next year, and then also higher than expected turnover savings with more retirements than we've seen in prior years. So we took this preliminary budget surplus of $451,000 and shifted it to the general fund contingency account for our tentative budget so that we could address any future compensation or staffing level issues and any other inflationary changes we may see in the future. In addition to having an ongoing structurally balanced budget, we also had some one-time expenditures and savings for the FY23 budget. The main cost we had that was a one-time cost was a COVID differential for the Washoe Education Association, about $6.3 million. We identified some textbook savings since we'll be paying for textbooks out of stimulus fundings next year, and the other half of that cost will also be paid by a one-time use of fund balance. So again, almost our entire budget is funded by the state, and we had a minimal 1.3% per pupil funding increase for FY23. We can only spend what we're given, and so that resulted in about a $450,000 budgeted surplus, and we put that in our contingency account to address future issues. So budgeting isn't just a 1 year at a time thing. We're looking far ahead into the future. So I'm going to hand it off to Mark to talk about our short-term issues.
Thanks, Jeff. So during this fiscal year for sure, and going into next fiscal year, which starts on July 1, We know our costs are increasing rapidly because of the inflation we're seeing in the markets. What we buy through our purchasing department is certainly going up, but even worse than that, we know that pay for many of our positions, whether it's a bus driver and what other driver positions in Northern Nevada are now paying, there's a gap. We are falling short of paying those drivers where they can, what they could get elsewhere. So we know that's impacting us greatly. We have, as most of you know, really significant labor shortage in a number of areas. We didn't have enough bus drivers earlier in the year and don't currently to run all the bus routes we want to. So that's something we will need to address in the short and intermediate term, and actually met with the Board of Trustees on April 12th to identify some solutions to that. But it's an ongoing challenge for us. We also know that with stimulus funding, we can do great things. We're addressing the learning loss our students suffered during COVID and doing a lot of wonderful things, but that stimulus funding ends in 2024, and then what? So that's going to be something we will have to address in the coming years. And we know we want to fund improvement in academic achievement of our students, and again, we'll have to look to the state for that. We can't produce money on our own. We can't print money in the basement. We'll need the state to come through and help us invest more in that regard. And along the same lines, we know our class sizes are above national averages and are unacceptably high. But to address it, we really do need increased funding from the state, and that's why we'll be lobbying the state in the 2023 session for more funding.
So in addition to short-term issues, we also have several long-term issues that we're experiencing. So on the revenue impact side, enrollment is always one of the major factors of our budget, and we're expecting an enrollment decline over the next several years due to an enrollment bubble. So we have in our secondary grades, class sizes, or the entire class of those high schoolers are higher than the incoming grades. So as they graduate, they'll be replaced with grade levels with lower number of students, which will result in a revenue decrease. We also have more charter schools opening up in the district, and as students go to the charter schools, that also impacts our district's enrollment. When the stimulus funds fall off, we'll have lower indirect cost revenue, so we'll feel that impact. And then on the expenditure side, we have inflation, which we've talked about earlier, keeping pace with wages, and then any new strategic plan initiatives we may have with a new superintendent, and then any programs that we may need to continue when the stimulus funds drop off. And in addition to that, we have a legislative session next year that'll impact the next biennium. So lastly, I want to go through the rest of our budget process. So we're in mid-April right now, so that means our next budget work session is on April 26th. So we'll be presenting to the board on that day with a review of budget analysis and recommendations for a few new positions and reorganizations. And then on May 24th at the board meeting, we'll go have a hearing on our tentative budget, and we'll finalize recommendations for the final budget, hopefully adopt the final budget that day so that we can submit it by the June 8th deadline. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. So Colleen, I believe we have some questions tonight.
We certainly do. Thank you, Mark and Jeff, for a great presentation. As we mentioned, we have received some, and we still invite you to submit questions, but we'll go ahead and get started because we have quite a list of ones that have come in already. And I'm going to start with one that we get every budget forum that we do. It's about the marijuana tax money, as it seems there's some confusion out there. So if you could clarify for us and maybe provide updates, CFO Mark, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Colleen. This is a question that always seems to come up, and it was true that in the past the state was depositing a good portion of the marijuana tax revenues into its general fund. enough people clamored about that a few years ago the legislature changed that, and actually nearly all of the marijuana tax revenues that the state taxes on sales of marijuana now do in fact go to fund K through 12 education, and that is now additive. They were taking that money and simply then reducing the state's general fund commitment for K through 12 education, but that's not happening anymore either. So I am glad to report, like I say, virtually all marijuana tax money goes to K through 12 education now, and it's additive.
Great. Thank you for that update. Appreciate it. Another question we've received, and I know it was addressed in the presentation, but I also know that our Chief Operating Officer, Pete Etchard, is here, so I think he might be best to address this. Has to do with our bus driver shortage and what options that the district is looking at to fix this.
Good evening, Pete Etchart, Chief Operating Officer, and that is definitely a great question. As our Chief Financial Officer said, this is we just had a detailed conversation with our board this past Tuesday on this critical matter. These are indeed difficult times when it comes to staffing, and this is a nationwide problem that we are definitely no exception in just trying to find our way to work through this. As far as fixing this problem, the short answer is that we are doing everything we can do to try and pursue options and find solutions that will help in this matter. And while there are no guarantees, we definitely do not want to continue with the area rotation calendar this next school year that we unfortunately had to implement in February. We discussed with our trustees all of the options we were looking at, and these range from our intense efforts in recruitment and retention, and also our more internal processes of really trying to be as efficient as we can and having optimization studies. And they range all the way, though, to, unfortunately, the more controversial items, such as looking at bell time changes or walk zone changes. So the bottom line is we're really looking at every option we can. But last Tuesday, we also received approval from our Board of Trustees to look into compensation changes for our driver positions, along with several other critical areas, custodians, food service workers, and special education's aides and assistants. Our Chief Human Resources Officer is leading negotiations with our employee associations on that matter. So again, we are looking at every option we can to try to work through this problem when it comes to staffing, especially in transportation.
Thank you, Pete. Appreciate that. That's an important question. This is an interesting question, and I believe we'll see if we can start with our superintendent to answer this one. And it states, how many certified staff are not in our classrooms? And for those ones, what do they do?
Oh, great question, and we actually get that question quite a bit, whether I'm out in the public or just in venues such as this. So within our 8,000 employees, we have approximately 225 certified staff that we would say are not directly into the classrooms. But that also includes our learning facilitators, includes our teachers on special assignments. People hear of TOSAs, that's what a TOSA is. It also includes our English language design, our ELD certified staff in there. Importantly, when we had the all hands on deck and we needed to get this, these are the staff members. So in curriculum and instruction, in our share office, we have certified staff. So again, around 8,000 employees total, and around 225 of those are certified staff that are not directly as classroom teachers.
Great. Thank you for that update and educating us on that. The next question is actually a really important one, and it has to do with the stimulus money that we've received. It's what progress did the district make this school year in spending stimulus dollars, and what are the district's achievements with this funding? And I believe there's probably several that can help answer this, or maybe our deputy superintendent would like to start with a response.
Thank you, Colleen, and good evening to our community. I'm Deborah Beiersdorf, and I'm proud to serve as the deputy superintendent. And I, along with quite a few folks on our team, work closely with our grants department that is responsible for ensuring that we're spending these stimulus funds correctly. So as they're known as ESSER, which is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Funding. And as was talked about earlier in this evening's presentation, the totality of that funding does end in 2024, and we're very, very mindful of that and very appreciative of the help as well. So the ESSER funds have basically come to Washoe County School District in 3 different waves, with the first wave happening with ESSER 1, and that's back when the pandemic pretty much first started. And those funds were around $10 million. And they've all been spent, and they help to fund things like PPE, which is a new term many of us learned, personal protective equipment, our learning packets that were generated that last quarter of the 2019-2020 school year, improvements to our HVAC systems in our schools, and a number of other initiatives or projects that were done to help us effectively educate our kids during the beginning of the pandemic. Subsequently, ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 funding have gone primarily to supports that are directly impacting and supporting our kids in our classrooms and our teachers in our schools. So as Dr. McNeil mentioned earlier with the previous question, learning facilitators. Every one of our elementary schools has an LF, and in part that learning facilitators' responsibilities is to help our students catch up because of the effects of the pandemic, especially around English language arts and mathematics. So we're very busy ensuring that we're correctly and strategically and efficiently and thoughtfully spending the stimulus funds. And what I would really encourage folks to do is to go to our district's website, washoeschools.net, and right there on the first page or the landing page, you'll see a link. And it says ESSER funding, and it's a really, really good resource that will give lots more information than I'll be able to share this evening on that funding. And then for our community members and our parents, our families, don't hesitate to contact your child's school as well and find out how they are using their ESSER funds in helping our students in our classrooms.
Thank you, Debbie. Great answer. Appreciate the details there. Our next question states that on one of the slides, it states that class sizes are above national averages. And they are asking if this statistic is for the state of Nevada or Washoe County. And is that number still within the legislative requirements? Perhaps Jeff and our superintendent would like to answer this or flip for it. Jeff will start.
I'll take it. Thank you, Colleen. So the first part of the question was if it was Nevada or Washoe County, correct? Okay. So I believe those were statewide ratios. But as far as how we stack up against legislative requirements, we do have legislative requirements in kindergarten, first, second, and third grade for class sizes of 16-1 in kindergarten, first, and second grade, and 18-1 in third grade. However, the state hasn't historically funded us at those ratios, so what we do is meet the historically funded ratios. And in kindergarten, that's a ratio of 21-1. I believe we're just under that. And in first and second grade, the ratio is 17-1. And in third grade, the ratio is 20-1. We report on that information on a quarterly basis as required by law. And we do meet those historically funded ratios. Thank you.
Okay, that was a good question and a good answer. So thank you. Here we have a little bit of a tough question, I think. So I'm going to look at Mark, so he'll be listening closely. If Nevada wanted to get the average or the medium of states in terms of per pupil funding, how much more would that be, both in terms of per pupil dollars and total dollars? That's a 30,000 foot level question.
Yeah, I like that question. Kind of gets to the heart of, kind of where we're at. So I think we had, this slide does show you, whereas a state we compare, we're probably a little lower than the statewide average because, again, we receive the lowest per pupil funding of any district in the state. But we are shy, as you can see from this slide, by roughly $4,400 per student. So the national average in terms of per pupil funding, and again it includes all funding sources, so no one's playing games here, is $15,673. The state's per pupil revenue amount in fiscal year 20 was $11,236. And again, we're probably a little bit lower than that. So conservatively, that's a difference of, let's call it rounded to $4,400 that we're short on a per student basis. So every student, if we wanted to be at the national average, should be getting $4,400 more in services. If we multiply that by 62,000 students in the district, that's a mere, I'm going to round it, a mere $270 million that we're short if we just wanted to be at the national average. And so obviously that's a huge number, but you can also see what kind of, or think about what kind of impact that would have to lower class sizes and hire more teachers. It would make just a transformational kind of change for the school district if the state actually funded schools just at the national average. So it's a big number, but it would do a lot of good, to put it mildly.
Great, thank you, Mark. And that segues a little bit into our next question, which I believe our Chief Human Resources Officer would be able to answer best. Without quality teachers, public education in Nevada will continue to fall well below the national level. Is there a budget in place to continue to recruit and retain high-quality teachers?
Emily Ellison for the record. That is a great question. While there's not specifically a line item in the budget dedicated to recruiting and retention, there certainly are resources within the human resources budget for those efforts, specifically for recruiting efforts. And then retention is really more about kind of the employee experience, right? So we know compensation is an important part of that, and we would work with our associations to negotiate any of those types of benefits. But the employee experience also has a substantial impact on whether or not someone leaves an organization. And so Human Resources is, of course, here to help our school and department leaders to address any challenges that they have in that area. And we're always focused on recruiting the best talent. So if anyone is interested in a position with the district, please contact us at 775-325-TEAM, and we will figure out where you fit. Thank you.
Nice sales
Colleen.
plug. Yes,
And
go ahead.
I'll just add to that as
Certainly.
well, too. I think it's important, that we stress when we're talking about not only retention, but also recruiting. And so our leadership team, under the leadership of Emily, and as well as our area superintendents, we've been able to start programs that we refer to as Grow Your Own. And so, for example, I was just over at AACT the other day, and we actually have a program there that we are growing our own teachers. And so the students over at AACT actually go over to Hidden Valley Elementary School, and they're integrated into the classroom so that they can learn to be teachers. And then, importantly, they're actually able to graduate from AACT with a certified status so they can go right into a support staff. And so then we can start growing our own teachers and support staff within our own school districts, and that helps everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. We have a question here, and it's also something that was on one of our slides. Someone's asking if we can expand on what the WEA COVID differential is. Mark or Mark, you look excited to turn on your microphone.
I was looking at Emily again. She's coming up.
Thank you. Emily Ellison for the record. The COVID differential is the benefit that was negotiated during our bargaining with the Washoe Education Association, and it provides for one-time payments for the additional work that our staff members were responsible for during the COVID pandemic. So if you think about our teachers, for example, during the hybrid model where we had middle and high school students 50% in the building one day and 50% at home and then flip-flop, that obviously increased the complexity of the job substantially. And then when you factor in exclusions and many of the other new procedures that were required, there definitely was a heavy lift for our educators and our employees. And so again, during the negotiations process, we negotiated with WEA to pay those one-time incentives.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that, Emily. The next, I'm going to call them a couple of questions I think would come under our operations area. We've received a few about the small repairs at schools and what the budget is for those. The question also asks about aging equipment and chipping paint at the school, and they'd like to know this. It sounds like it's a parent, and they'd like to know how they can ensure these are funded. Another question specifically says that their child's school is more than 50 years old and hasn't seen repairs in quite some time, and they'd like to know what the process for that is. So, Pete, can you walk us through that, please?
Sure. Pete Etchart, Chief Operating Officer again, and maybe I'll start at the big picture, then kind of might work our way down. So when the voters approved WC1 back in 2016, or the Capital Projects Funding Initiative, there were really three components of that the district vowed to deliver. The most pressing need at that time was overcrowding, and so we started right away on building new schools. And after completing 3 new elementary schools, 3 new middle schools, a high school addition, we have a new high school coming this summer we're very excited about, the new Hug High School. We have the J. Wood Raw Elementary School coming the following summer in 2023. We have the Debbie Smith Career and Technical High School coming in 2024. We feel like we're in a really good place when it comes to the overcrowding issue. Now, the second and third components of WC1 were our needs to get caught up on critical repair needs and really undertake those renovations at our existing schools. And that can range all the way from those small projects you're kind of talking about all the way to replacing a school, is kind of what you're seeing right now at the O'Brien Middle School. And that will also open this coming summer. So due to WC1, we've been able to increase our revenue to doing those second and third components I just talked about. Our critical repairs budget has really gone up from about $15 to $20 million a year, and that's going to go up to about $35 to $45 million a year in the next several years. And this last Tuesday, our board also approved the funding recommendation that was brought to them from the Capital Funding Protection Committee to do a modernization study of our older schools. And that is going to help the district in not only looking at what should be in our schools with the help of our community, but it's also going to help us in prioritizing the schedule of when those improvements are going to be done. And our 5-year CIP that was also approved by our board is showing that we're going to put $135 million a year into our existing schools starting in that 23-24 school year. So we've got a lot going on at our schools. And I think the focus in the past was on that overcrowding issue. I think we're going to continue to build schools as growth dictates, but I think you're really going to start seeing a shift into putting our resources into our existing schools much more so. When it comes to those small little projects, and we always appreciate the eyes and ears of our parents and staff who say, hey, this is something in our school that needs to be improved, really recommend telling your principal, telling the teachers, so they can tell what's called the site facility coordinator to put in a work order so that our staff knows it's there. They always try to see what's going on, but we always appreciate, again, parents seeing it also. So put it in there, it gets prioritized, and we can come out and get the job done.
Great, thank you much. And I know we're getting close to the time, but we have some more questions I'd like to ask, so if we can answer as concisely as possible. So Jeff, I think this one is one that you could have a quick answer for us on how big of an impact do things like inflation and fuel costs have on us now, and what's the projection for this next year?
So thank you for the question. We do feel the impacts of inflation, especially on fuel. During the current year's budget in December, we had transferred $425,000 from our general fund contingency budget to our transportation fuel budget to cover those costs. We do have a $4 million or just over $4 million general fund contingency account to address any unforeseen inflation or other one-time costs. So we have that in the budget. We did build in, I think it was $850,000 in additional just fuel cost for the fiscal year 23 budget, so next year's budget, to help address those inflationary issues.
Thank you. And now we have a follow-up question to our Deputy Superintendent's answer previously about ESSER. They're asking that if each school got a learning facilitator at elementary, middle, and high school levels, and then when that money ends in 2024, does that mean every LF will lose their position?
Thanks, Colleen. I'll start, and then I'm going to invite up,
Great.
here she is, our Chief Human Resources Officer. So just as a reminder, the ESSER funds primarily to ESSER 2 and 3, primarily intended to help with addressing any learning loss or academic needs our students have as a result of the pandemic. So the learning facilitator LF position is very much focused on academic intervention and support for our students and assistance for our teachers for the next this school year and the next 2 school years as well. So that real intense focus, and that was the primary purpose and thought behind bringing on those positions. But I'll turn it over to Emily about the kind of the human resources side of that.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you for the question, Colleen. So from an HR perspective, I think the part 2 of this question is what happens to the employees in the event that a position is eliminated either because of a funding change or an enrollment change. And so our negotiated agreements provide guidance to us for those situations. The type of contract that an employee was hired under would dictate whether or not they would be entitled to a new position. But the vast majority of our employees are hired on standard or limited term contracts, which entitles them to another position in the district should their position go away. There are a handful of folks that were hired during the last school year specifically into some of these grant-funded positions or into some of our other positions that we know are not as hard to fill, and those folks were hired on 1-year only contracts, and so their positions would end, but they'd have the opportunity to secure other positions once we get through the transfer period.
Perfect. Thank you, ladies. Appreciate it. And I'm going to have us do one final question before we wrap up. And it talks about the previous budget presentation to the board, so probably at one of our work sessions would be my guess. The rise in insurance premiums over the last several years for property and liability insurance was mentioned. And they're asking for information on these increases and if we can explain why. So that sounds like a CFO kind of question. Mark?
Sure. So I'm scrambling for a report that would give me that. However, by memory, I believe our property insurance costs, along with our other insurance, was around $2.4 million back in fiscal year 19, and we're now around $4 million for insurance coverage. So this covers, just like your homeowner's insurance, this covers damages to schools that happen because of an earthquake. Well, maybe not an earthquake so much, but wildfires or, what have you. And really just basically the reason for that is twofold. One, in the global insurance industry, they've seen the frequency and level of damage of just global events like the wildfires that we see now and the hurricanes and so forth just increased dramatically. And the second reason is we're building more schools, so our exposure from an insurance standpoint is increasing. So we annually rebid those insurance coverage policies so that we get the best price, but this is just happening nationwide. Maybe people have seen this in their own household insurance costs, but certainly that's happening here.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, we are at our time limit now, so we thank everybody who has submitted a question in advance or this evening. And at this stage, I'd like to turn it over to our Board Vice President, Dr. Nicolette.
Thank you, Colleen. Once again, my name is Trustee Diane Nicolette, and I serve as your Vice President on the Washoe County School Board of Trustees. A little redundant, sorry about that. On behalf of my fellow trustees and the Washoe County School District staff, I want to thank you for participating in our virtual budget forum this evening. The budget is of utmost importance to us as trustees, and your thoughts, feedback, and input is critically important. We have the responsibility of oversight for the district budget, and we recognize the importance of this stewardship and important responsibility. I appreciate, as do my colleagues, that you have taken the time to join us and make this information a priority. Our sincere thanks for joining us this evening. Good night and stay well. Thank you.